Hi everyone, Stepan here. In this video I'm going to continue the Queen's Gambit Decline series with the Tartakower Defense, one of the most popular and most solid variations of the Queen's Gambit Decline. But at the same time, it's a defense or a variation of the QGD which accepts a structural concession which is highly likely to occur, which makes it suitable for dynamic players and players willing to accept static weaknesses and players who know how to play with static weaknesses, who know how to use them or how to dissolve them. This is the starting position of the Tartakower, and it occurs after the moves d4, d5, c4, e6, the Queen's Gambit declined. Knight to c3, knight to f6, the main moves, bishop g5, bishop e7, knight f3, h6, bishop to h4, and here castles is the most common move, e3 by white. And in this position there are several options. Knight b to d7 is an option. This is the neo-orthodox variation. Knight e4 is an option. This is the Lasker defense. We are going to go over that in a separate video. Today we are looking at the move b6, the Tartakower. And what's the idea behind b6? Well, obviously the move prepares to fianchetto the dark squared bishop on b7. And that's a very good square for the bishop. As we know, one of the main strategic issues of the Queen's Gambit decline, same as in the Semislav defense, is the c8 bishop. And developing it has to be done by either playing c5 or e5 when the pawn is still on b7. In this position, the bishop finds a very natural square here. The downside is you have a pawn on d5. And as we are going to see in many variations of the Tartakower, this pawn on d5 is going to be there permanently after white exchanges it, because there is going to be no good way to recapture with pieces. Okay, and the resulting structural weaknesses I was talking about, I would like to show in this position, just to give you an example. Okay, so bishop to h4, castle, c3, b6, cd5. If you have a look at this position, we can see that black has a sort of loose center. After the move c5, white can continue with queen to a3, rook to c8. And after this exchange happens, we have so-called hanging pawns on d5 and c5, which are at the same time a strength and a weakness. Schrodinger's pawns, they are weak and strong at the same time, same as an isolated queen's pawn, same as, let's say, doubled pawns in the center. They could be useful, they could be a liability. In this position, they control a lot of central squares, but they are hard to defend. So this is a weakness. Another weakness which could occur is a pawn on d5, which is isolated, and blocks the b7 bishop, as we are going to see in some variations. So playing the Tartakower can mean that you basically have to accept some weaknesses. After e3, b6 in the Tartakower, you can expect to have a weaker pawn structure than white, and you are going to have to compensate for that dynamically. Now, this defense is very popular. It has been played by Karpov and Kasparov in their World Championship matches. In 1984, it was played in, I think, 7 games. Most of the games ended up in a draw because the Tartakower is very solid, but I'm going to show you one game in which Kasparov played very dynamically with the black pieces, and I'm going to show you some ideas of how to play with the Tartakower weaknesses. Now let's get into the opening. The first variation I would like to look at, so after d4, d5, c4, e6, knight e3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, knight f3, h6, is the anti-Tartakower. The normal position is bishop to h4, of course, going into the Tartakower, and after castles, pawn to e3, b6 is the Tartakower defense. White has a way to avoid all that theory with the anti-Tartakower simply taking on f6. Now, white has given up his bishop pair, he has given up his dark squared bishop, and this is an idea similar to the Moscow variation of the Semislav. But in exchange for that, he gets easy development. e3 castles, rook to c1, c6. Now, of course, black has a problem here. This is a very big problem. This is very similar to the Semi-Slav, and the anti-Tartakower is going to be uncomfortable to players who are not familiar with Semi-Slav plans. So in this position, black is going to have to play very actively to get rid of his weakness. He does have the bishop pair, but for the moment, his light-squared bishop is just useless. Bishop to d3. Knight to e7 castles, and now one of the main ideas from the Semi-Slav defense that we can employ here, using this tempo gaining dc4 to provoke the bishop to take, and then either advance with e5 or b5. Here there is no need for b5, that would be too weakening. e5 is sufficiently defended, supported by the f6 bishop, so once we play the move e5, black has almost equalized. Pawn to h3 is possible, knight to e4 is also possible, that's a very interesting option. Knight e4, after knight e4, ed4, knight f6, queen d4. And in this position, they have reached complete equality almost. Black's bishop pair looks nice, but it's going to get traded off. You're going to see how. For the moment, it may seem that white is slightly worse, has the IQP, and also black has the bishop pair, but rook e1, rook to e8, rook takes, queen to d2, and now there's this very nice idea white has, knight to e5, to either start an attack or to simply force black to give up his bishop pair. Queen to d7. Now a lot of pressure on d4 already, rook to e1. Rook to d8, now a ton of pressure, and now we have bishop to queen to f4. I'm sorry, attacking the light-squared bishop, and something here has to be done. Several moves have been tried. Bishop g6 is the best move. g5 can also be played, but since the bishop is defended, but bishop to g6 is better. It basically means that you are leaving the defense of your bishop, so bishop takes d4 is not possible. Now bishop to g6, reinforcing the threat, and knight to e5. And in this position, white is threatening to take on g6, double black's pawns on the g file, which wouldn't be good, or simply take the queen if nothing is done. So bishop takes e5. D takes e5, and we now have a balanced position once again. Equal material, white doesn't have the IQP anymore. If anybody is better, I'd like to say it's white, because he has a much better bishop on b3, but it should be a fairly equal position. So after h6, if you're afraid to enter the Tartakower with white, just take on f6, learn 10 or 20 moves of theory, and you should be fine. That being said, the anti-Tartakower is not even closely as ambitious, as the normal line. So if you play white, you play for the win. So you don't really do this. It's a solid opening though. All right, now let's get into the normal positions. So in this position, of course, after bishop h4 is played and castles is played, and e3 bishop to pawn to b6, white has several options. His options are either bishop to d3, which is a very normal developing move, bishop to e2, developing the bishop to a slightly less active square, but dc doesn't come with tempo in that case, and that's a subtlety in the Semi-Slav as well. When bishop to e2 is played, dc4 isn't as useful because white can just continue with e4. So in this case, if bishop to e2 and d takes c4 is played, bishop takes c4 can be played, but white can also continue with castles and have a normal position. So yeah, bishop to e2 is serving the purpose of not being a tempo gain for black. So bishop to d3, bishop to e2. A very interesting move is rook to c1, which Karpov used to play a lot. We are going to look at a game in which he went rook to c1. And one option which I love most for white is simply taking cd and highlighting the weakness in black structure. In fact, let's look at that move first. So c takes d5. After b6, c takes d5. This forces black into a position with hanging pawns, and we have looked at that example position when I started the video. So here you can either take with the e-pawn or with the knight. What you don't want to have is a pawn on d5, so at least you can postpone that with knight takes d5. Of course, the bishop is now attacked. So bishop takes e7. If white here goes bishop to g3, then black can retreat the knight and play the bishop to b7, have a very good position. So bishop to e7 forces a trade. Queen takes e7. And now knight takes d5, e takes d5. After bishop to e7, if you play knight takes e7, then the move bishop to d3 just seems a bit too active for white, and e4 is going to be played easily. So it's not that you don't want a pawn on d5, you want it because it's necessary to stop e4 and to stop white's central expansion, but it's still a weakness. So after queen e7, knight d5, e d5, we now have this first weakness I was talking about. You are not really going to be developing your bishop to b7. So why play b6? Well, if you don't play b6, you don't achieve a position like this. You play normal Queen's Gambit decline, either classical, orthodox, or the Lasket defense. Once you play b6, white will do his best to avoid giving you a perfect bishop on b7 without the hindrance of the pawn on d5. But he can fight it. So in this position, rook to c1, attacking c7. And kind of ironically, the bishop goes to e6. So you've played b6, but then bishop e6. Queen to a4. Starting to put pressure on black's queen side and developing. c5, you want to play this move to open the position up, get rid of the weakness. Queen to a3, now pinning the pawn to the queen. Rook to c8, bishop to e2 trying to develop. Queen to f8, this is the best move, just getting out of the pin. And now dc5, bc5 castles, and we have a standard hanging pawns position in which neither side is really better. I would say, but I would say that on a higher level, the hanging pawns are easier to play because players have more experience. If you remember Bobby Fischer's famous hanging pawns game, game 6 against Spassky, and it's just easier to play them if you are good. If you are bad, then they are a liability. So I think that the Tartakower defenses, if I had to assign a difficulty level to it, I would say it's 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10, whereas the Ragozin, which I covered in the last video, would be maybe 4 or 5 out of 10. I just don't think it's easy to play with hanging pawns or with a pawn on d5. So cd5, in my opinion, the best way for white to play, simply forcing this weakness. Now, if you're unlucky and you run into a player who's played this a million times, well, then you lose. But it still should be slightly better for white. Now let's look at bishop to d3 and bishop to e2. There isn't that big of a difference between the two moves, except taking on c4. Bishop d3 is the main line, by far the most popular move. The difference in this line is that since no captures are happening on d5, black has time enough to get his bishop to b7. The point of b6. White castles, black continues his development normally, knight b to d7, and after queen to e2, black is now prepared to play the move c5. This is similar to the Queen's Indian, which is going to come on the channel soon. With the bishop on b7, you want the knight on d7, you want to play c5. You want to open up the queen side for your pieces to be active, for your pieces to have enough space. Knight d7, of course, supports the move c5. And this is the ideal setup in the Tartakower. This is what you are going to get most games. And remember that as soon as you can, play c5, as soon as you have finished developing your minor pieces. Now, the idea behind queen e2 is perfectly normal, and this is the advantage of bishop to d3 to bishop to e2, and which is why bishop to d3 is way more popular. Queen to e2 does two things. Firstly, connects your rooks. In the Tartakower, white's rooks belong here. Firstly, because those are just the most active squares. Secondly, because black is about to either have hanging pawns or a weak structure with an open c-file, and you will either be exerting pressure on the c7 pawn if black plays passively, or you will be attacking a pair of hanging pawns or a pawn on d5. The other thing behind queen e2 is that it supports the e4 break. Of course, in all queen's pawn openings, white's dream is playing e4, same as if black plays the Sicilian, his dream is to play d5. For white, in d4 openings, e4 is the break, which he tries to achieve in the Ragozin, in the Nimzo Indian, in the Semi-Slav, in many openings. So c5. Here, another option which I would like to mention is knight e4. Knight e4 is a Queen's Indian type of idea, where you are prepared to ruin your pawn structure, to dislodge the f3 knight and then follow that up with f5. If white is not careful, this move is very strong, and this is in fact my favorite variation for black. In this position, black could take on e7, but it's much better to simply trade the bishop off here and allow knight takes g3. You definitely don't want to take here. First of all, if you take with the knight, you lose a piece. If you take with the bishop, then this knight goes to d2, and after f5, it's really not easy to develop, and these knights don't really have good squares. The bishop again will get traded off, and black can look forward to a strong attack with f4. So bishop to g3, c5 now, cd5, ed5, rook f to d1, and now knight takes, h takes, and c4. And this is another advantage of playing the move knight to e4. As soon as you can get this move c4 in, this is similar to some variations of the Ragozin we have been looking at. You now have a 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side, which can be very dangerous. Another thing is you're restricting the light squared bishop and the queen for white. So, for example, bishop c2, queen d3 is not possible. And you're gaining a tempo, so now the bishop will have to move. And after something like bishop to c2, rook to e8, I really like black's position. Of course, this is a weakness. Of course, your bishop is bad. You still have a job to do. If you go knight f6, then knight e5 is annoying. White has enough, and the downside of the move c4 is the move e4. And as soon as white plays the move e4, he will have liberated his center and basically accepted an IQP here, but will have very active pieces. So this is a variation I like a lot. So after queen to e2, which you are going to see in every game, play knight e4. It's very interesting. Remember this idea with c4. Okay, but the main move is c5 without knight e4, rook f to d1. White simply develops his rooks to the best possible squares. And now play knight e4 is the main line that can transpose with bishop to g3. So I just don't like the idea of playing c5 first, because white has several things he can do to avoid knight to e4. Firstly, he can go c takes d5, and now the position is changing after knight takes d5. Of course, you're not playing knight to e4. The other thing he can do is simply go bishop to g3 in advance, and after knight to e4, we have c takes d5. So again, the position is changing. You're not playing c4 that easily. E takes d5, rook a to d1. So just remember a move order thing, that after queen to e2, if you want to make sure that you get the active position, go knight e4 first. c5, as I said, allows sidelines, but most probably you're going to get the same thing after bishop to g3, cd4. After bishop to g3, you're going to get the same thing. So here, the position, as I said, can result in hanging pawns for black again. So let's say black does something passive here. Let's play a passive move, such as a6. And for white, okay, let's take here. And let's take here. And now you can see how loose the structure is. And that being said, this is not a big problem for black. These pawns are a strength at the same time as they are a weakness. Here, black would have actually captured on c3. But this is just something that could happen in your game. The move order is never going to be exactly the same past move 10 or 12 or 15. And your opponent may surprise you. But remember that these are the positions you are going to be playing at. Very similar to the Queen's Indian defense. I have recently played a game like this against Željko Matic in the Zagreb Open, where I had hanging pawns on d5 and c5 with the bishop on b7. Very interesting game. To be honest, I didn't even consider the Tartakower at that point because I didn't know much about it. I was playing it as a Queen's Indian, but it's basically a very similar position. So let's go over the main lines. After knight to e4, bishop to g3, c5 c5 has already been played. That's the difference here. And after the move c5 has been played, you now have several options. You can go knight takes g3, which is fine, and after h takes g3, c takes d4, you have c takes d4, you have the position we have been looking at, knight takes d4, knight to f6. But the more popular option is after the move bishop to g3 to go c takes d4 immediately. And with the move c takes d4, e takes d4, we are now going to get a position in which after d takes c4, white has a perfect isolated queen's pawn position. And I would recommend games by Karpov. Again, Karpov was playing this with white. Alexander Belyavsky played this with white. Romanishin played this with white. So a lot of strong players from the 80s, 90s, 70s have played this. And I would like to say that my article on the IQP, the introduction, first out of 3 articles, has just been published on pawnbreak.com. So have a look at that if you want to know more about these positions. I'm just going to talk about some of the main features. And since this is the main line of the Tartakower, this is something you can expect. So I'm just going to repeat how to enter this position again. So d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, knight f3, h6. You should know this by now. Bishop h4, castle, c3, b6, the Tartakower. White plays bishop to d3. The main move, preparing for queen e2, rook d1, rook c1. Bishop to b7, castles, knight b to d7, normal development. After queen e2, black should strike with c5 or play knight e4. c5 is the main move. Rook f to d1, knight to e4, bishop to g3, and now c takes d4, trading off his center and isolating the pawns. Now taking with the knight isn't such a good option because black is going to have an easier time in the center. It can be played, and it has been played several times. Knight takes d4, but now after knight takes c3, b takes c3, something like either knight c5 or taking on c4 is going to give black just a better pawn structure. Let's say you take here, bishop takes. I mean, I just like black's position here. So he takes d4. Knight takes g3, h takes g3, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight to f6. Okay, so an IQP position from the Tartakower main line. Now, what are the ideas here? First of all, white has an isolated queen's pawn. What you want to do with it, you want to blockade it. You don't want to attack it straight away. You want to make sure that the weakness is fixed, and then you want to target it later. So a move like knight d5 is a very natural move. The good thing for black is that white doesn't have his dark squared bishop, so at least there is no pressure here, and the pressure on g7 is therefore indirectly reduced. But black needs to do a lot of things before he can trade pieces off into a favorable endgame with a structural weakness for white. What white is going to do, he's going to get his knight into e5. This knight is perfect for classical isolated queen's pawn sacrifices on f7. So in many positions, let's say, okay, I'll just give you an example. Bishop b4 is the main move here. And something like rook a to c1 by white. And it doesn't work in this case. It's not that easy to make it work. After rook takes, bishop takes, you are winning an exchange in the pawn for 2 pieces, but and 2 pawns. You are giving up 2 pieces for rook and 2 pawns, which is not that good, but stuff like that could work. So this is the idea behind knight e5. The other thing is, the other white pieces are going to try to get into the game. For example, if the blockade is set up with knight to d5, then a move like queen to g4 or a move like queen to h5 is very dangerous, especially queen g4, which is very thematic, lending support to this idea. Therefore, black plays the move bishop to b4. This move is designed to trade the pieces off. He would like to trade off his bishop for this knight because that would reinforce the d5 square. Black, of course, never wants to set up a blockade on d5 when it can be exchanged up to a point where a pawn has to take. So knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes is still fine because it's a piece here. But if black is forced to recapture with the pawn, then this is no longer a weakness. You have an identical weakness. So that's something you can expect out of the Tartakower if white wishes to go for that. So to recap the video, the main lines of the Tartakower will lead to dynamic positions for white in which he has an isolated queen's pawn and starts attacking. But white also has a pleasant choice of c takes d5 or rook to c1, getting into lines where black is the one with the structural weakness and black has to play actively. To finish the video, I'm going to show you the game Karpov-Kasparov from 1984. b6. Okay, in this position, Kasparov is playing black. Karpov went rook to c1, bishop to b7, and here, rook to c1. The main lines after rook to c1 and bishop to b7 are bishop takes f6, Bishop takes f6, c takes d5, e takes d5, leaving white with this weakness, leaving black with this weakness on d5. That's not what happened in the game. And another thing that should be pointed out, if c takes d5, bishop takes d5, where black tries to preserve his pawn structure without a pawn on d5, well, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, you have given up the bishop pair, you have this weakness. This was a useless move, and white should stand slightly better after something like bishop to d3. You have to defend on c7, although white probably can't have taken before because of knight c6 trying to trap the rook. So okay, bishop to d3, something like rook to c8, a3 defending a2, knight to d7, castles, and white has a slight advantage, which is annoying. e4, of course you don't have a pawn on d5, so it's easy to play this. Therefore, after rook to c1, the main move after bishop e7 is bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, c takes d5, e takes d5. And now this is kind of annoying. So bishop to d3, c5 has to be played, castles, c takes d4 is the main move, e takes d4, knight to c6. Both sides have this isolated queen's pawn, but the difference is that white's bishop is on b7 and black doesn't have a light squared bishop. So this structure, in my opinion, benefits white. So this is the move rook to c1, a very interesting move. In the game Karpov-Kasparov, after rook to c1, bishop to b7, Karpov didn't take on f6. He played this idea with bishop to e2. And this is probably, well, this is less common than taking on f6, and it's not giving up the bishop that soon, at least in this game. It wasn't, it was taken on g3. So we are basically allowing the maneuver with knight to e4 if black wishes to play it, and then stuff is going to get exchanged on g3 at some point if black wants to do it. If not, your bishop is going to stay on g3. Knight b to d7, and this is all theory. C takes, e takes, castles, c5, queen a4, a6, all theory. B takes, rook f to d1, queen to b6. And here we have a classical Tartakower position where black has hanging pawns and black has to play dynamically. And luckily this was played by Kasparov, so he knew how to play dynamic chess. The main move here for white is queen to b3, offering a queen exchange. You don't want to accept, of course, because your weaknesses are more prominent than white's. So you play queen to a7. Bishop to g3, getting the bishop to a better square and making sure that these aren't discoveries on the bishop. There is no tension on this diagonal. Rook a to d8, knight to e1. That's also one of the, well, one of the more popular moves. And now in this position, here is how to play the Tartakower. This is the advanced part of the video because this is sort of a middle game idea, but I wanted to show you this game. So in this position, you have a weakness, a structural weakness. You have an isolated pawn on a6, you have hanging pawns, whereas white's pawn structure is perfect. So what you do here, you try to dissolve that. Now this subjectively may not be the best move. It may be better to play rook c8 and then rook f to d8. But Kasparov went for d4. And now this changes the position a lot. Of course, it has to be taken. You don't want to allow this by moving the knight. So e takes, c takes, knight a4. And what we see in this position, black has traded off one weakness for another. He no longer has hanging pawns. He has an isolated queen's pawn, which has advanced from d5 to d4. So normal attacking plans with knight e4 and standard stuff we saw in reverse doesn't really work. And when the isolated queen's pawn advances from the 5th rank for white, or conversely from the 4th rank for white, then it becomes a bigger liability. Rook to c8 played here by Kasparov. Rook takes. Rook takes. Of course, Karpov doesn't mind exchanging pieces. The more pieces get exchanged off, d4 becomes a bigger weakness. Bishop to c4. Rook to f8. Now there was problem on the f7 square. Queen to d3, bishop to c6. And now, even though this is an isolated queen's pawn position for black, I have a feeling that white is attacking. Black's game isn't really that good. Bishop to b3 had to defend the knight, knight to e4, and now Kasparov starts activating his pieces. If you saw his famous octopus knight game against Karpov, where he played knight d3 without having the support of a pawn, this is similar. Knight e4 is a very strong knight for the moment, only defended by a piece, but it's not loose. Queen takes d4, and Karpov simply takes a pawn. Now, what's the idea behind that? White is just a pawn up. Of course, declining a queen trade, queen takes b7, but now we can see that there is a lot of pressure. Firstly on g2. Secondly, if this knight is traded off for the bishop and bishop takes knight, then sometimes you can win the b2 pawn. Bishop to d5 played. Of course, Karpov is Karpov, trades off the pieces. Very sensible idea. It's not a cowardly move, it's just the best move. Knight f6, bishop takes, queen takes, b3, solidifying his position. Now, does Kasparov really have something for the pawn? I don't think so. The position is almost equal, but white should be better. Black doesn't have enough compensation. Rook to e8, queen to d3, h5, queen to c4 played, offering another trade. And of course, if that's taken, white's pawn structure is ruined as well, but he would get a very dangerous passed pawn here. Queen to b7 still declines, of course. Knight to f3, finally getting his knight to a sensible square. Rook to c8, queen to e2. And now, yeah, black has better pieces. The knight on e5 is a great piece. The bishop on e7 has prospects. If the g3 bishop is traded off, that could be a strong attack. So ideally, knight takes g3, h takes g3, knight e5, and bishop c5, if this knight is removed, could be good. But Karpov, as you see, has prophylactically placed this knight on a4 and defended it, so this bishop isn't really such a good piece for the moment. For example, if he managed to get it to a7, that would be great, but that's very hard. Knight g4. Now coming in with the other knight, another attacking idea. So can he get enough pressure? Knight e5, knight takes g3, Karpov for the trade, h takes g3, and queen to b5, double attacking the knight. Knight c4 is a good move. Karpov played that. He offered the queen trade, so basically knight takes g4, loses the queen. Otherwise, Kasparov played queen to b5, I'm sorry. Otherwise, yeah, if knight takes knight, then queen takes queen. So knight to c4 here, attacking the bishop. Bishop to f6, knight a to b6, and rook to e8. And in this position, believe it or not, they agreed to a draw, which I don't really understand, but maybe Karpov was fearing this activity on f2. So it starts becoming obvious now that that maybe this bishop could be activated. If the bishop reaches the d4 square or the c5 square, then this spells trouble. So what I wanted to show you is this very active d4 by black. So Kasparov had hanging pawns, and he tried to dissolve them by accepting a weakness on d4 and isolated queen's pawn. So this is the sort of game you need to expect from the Tartakower. If white plays for a structural edge, you need to play dynamically. So the Tartakower is a defense in which you may find yourself with a long-term weakness as black, or you might find yourself with a long-term advantage as black, depending on what white wants to do. That is why I'm not a big fan of the Tartakower. It gives white the option to choose the nature of the position. Okay, let me know what you think about this. What do you think about including an example game in the video? I wouldn't want to do it as a detailed analysis, just to give an instructive example as d4 was the case here. Would you like to see that in future videos? Please let me know. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more chess. Bye.